Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How does the turmoil in Syria, Iraq, and Israel affect not only people in that area of the world, but many people around the world? What can be done by the United States, the United Nations, and other entities to help bring peace and stability to a very volatile area? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today we're putting the spotlight on the Middle East, especially Iraq, Syria, and Israel, and looking at the turmoil that's occurring there, but also what can be done possibly to help prevent much of the bloodshed and the suffering. My guest today is an expert on this area. My guest today is Dr. Michael Cairo. Dr. Michael Cairo is an associate professor of political science and director of the International Affairs program at Transylvania University. Dr. Cairo's first book, The Gulf, the Bush Presidencies in the Middle East, published in November 2012, focuses on conflict, diplomacy, and peace. Dr. Michael Cairo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's nice to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's get into your book. This is a good segue right into the Middle East. The title, as I mentioned, The Gulf, the Bush Presidencies, and the Middle East. What motivated you to write it, and what were some, now this was done in 2012.
It finished up in 2012.
Exactly. Right. A lot has occurred since 2012.
Yes, absolutely.
But what were some of the main themes in this book?
Well, the book started as a comparison of the two Bush presidencies, particularly their decision-making style and foreign policies in the Middle East, with a focus on the decisions to intervene in Iraq, but also the aftermath of those decisions. As you know, George H.W. Bush decided not to go into Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein, whereas his son decided from the beginning that it was necessary to remove Saddam Hussein. And George H.W. Bush, in thinking about that aftermath, was concerned about some of the problems we see today, including civil war and the sectarianism that could emerge out of the removal of Saddam Hussein.
And it certainly has. A lot of foreign policy experts, scholars, and a variety of journalists, what have you, have looked at the two Bushes, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and they go back to 1990-91 and how the first, Bush 41, utilized the United Nations Security Council very well, went to the Security Council, got a resolution to oust Saddam Hussein from his...
16 resolutions when you go back
and
look at it.
Yeah. Out of Kuwait at that time. He mobilized really a coalition, a real diverse coalition with Arab countries, with countries from all around the world to a large degree. Then you contrast that to 2003, where George W. Bush ignored the United Nations. He, well, for obvious reasons.
He thought the United Nations was a debating club, in his opinion.
Exactly, and he did not have really didn't have the evidence against Saddam Hussein. And a lot of the foreign policy people at that time said that that was the case. And so he went around the United Nations, put together this coalition of the willing, and went in and deposed Saddam. As you look at that today, how that move, that action has been really, I think, publicized as probably the biggest foreign policy blunder in the United States history. The American public's totally against it. Being in Iraq, the public opinion around the world's against it. The United Nations countries, 193, the majority are against it. But how was that decision instrumental in helping to destabilize that whole Middle Eastern area? Now, you can't say, what's happening in Syria is directly, but that really launched the destabilization, did it not?
Yeah, I think what you can say, though, is that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 did precisely what the Bush administration did not want to do, and that is it helped insurgents, Islamic insurgents in now ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. It helped those insurgents gain strength and power in the Middle East. And it also, ironically, helped Iran, which was part of the axis of evil, according to George W. Bush, because Iran's power has increased as a result of what's going on in the Middle East now. Since you have the support of Assad in Syria, and Iran essentially bailed Assad out. Without Iranian help, Assad would probably have fallen. And in Iraq, of course, you have Nouri al-Maliki as prime minister, who is a Shia prime minister, and there are reports that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard of Iran is on the ground assisting him, Nouri al-Maliki, in trying to push back these ISIL insurgents in the north. So the consequences of George W. Bush's decision and the war have resulted in precisely the opposite of what they thought would occur. I mean, George W. Bush believed that toppling Saddam Hussein would produce a democratic domino, in essence, that once you had democracy in Iraq, democracy would spread and flourish throughout the Middle East. And they argued that the Arab Spring demonstrated that. Yet the Arab Spring has become an Arab winter in many ways, with these democratic movements not quite going as far as most people had hoped in the process. So.
Exactly. And when you look at that whole area and look at what's transpiring today, a lot of people are asking, they're saying, well, who lost Iraq? A lot of people would go back and say, well, George W. Bush lost it by launching what is now widely viewed as an illegal invasion of a sovereign country. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Many people knew it back then, but they chose to overlook that particular set of facts and pieces of information, and they launched this war. And today, the situation has deteriorated so badly, and of course, everything we say today, tomorrow, by the time the show airs, will probably be history.
Well, I told you before the show, this afternoon, an Islamic State was declared across Syria and northern Iraq, with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the leader of that Islamic State. So already it's changed. But George W. Bush certainly overreached. The criticism that, of course, is coming out today is that Obama underreached with this. I think that criticism is somewhat misplaced. Right now in the Middle East, there are no easy choices and lots of hard dilemmas. Certainly, if we had gone into Syria, who are we going in to support? You have the problem of ISIL being one of the main groups that was opposed to and still is opposed to Assad. The concern about money being diverted to an ISIL-type group. And ISIL is so brutal that other al-Qaeda groups are disavowing them and saying that their brutality is far beyond even what al-Qaeda will accept. So this is a very complicated situation. The same can be said of Iraq. The American public isn't ready to go back into a war, nor should we. We shouldn't have been there in the first place. But you've got now a huge humanitarian problem with 1.7 million refugees, with a third of food insecure people, with a huge number of children who are being impacted by all of this devastation. Started in 2003, you could argue. Yeah.
Exactly. And even though the United Nations did not, the majority of the countries at the UN back in 2003, friends of the U.S. and Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and what have you, did not approve and did not agree with the invasion. After the invasion took place, the UN agencies did come online to help the Iraqis to rebuild their society, to help their sanitation system, to educational system, and on across the board. And today you still find the United Nations agencies in that area, not only in Iraq, Syria, the West Bank, just on across the board throughout the Middle East. So they are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main focus for the United Nations has been in the Kurdish regions of Iraq right now, where they have major refugee camps, and they are delivering food aid and other humanitarian aid, medical aid, to the refugees. The problem, of course, as you well know, comes into delivery and where the refugees are. And unfortunately, the United Nations can't always reach all the refugees that are out there.
Exactly, that's very, very true. One thing that's a little disconcerting is we look at the reporting on how this is being covered today. You're an expert on the Middle East, on Iraq, but it seems to me, it strikes me that we in the media have an obligation to try to provide better information this time around than we did in 2003. We look at how the media were manipulated in 2003. Even the New York Times had Judith Miller, who was getting a reporter, getting her information from Scooter Libby, who was an aide to Vice President Dick Cheney, who was putting out pieces of disinformation, misinformation, and then they'd put it in the New York Times and then say, well, it must be true. Here it is in the New York Times. But it seems that we really need to get objective voices on the air. And as I look at the media coverage of this right now, it seems to me like we're bringing the same folks back. We brought Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of State.
The architect of the war.
The architect of a failed policy, and they've been totally wrong. Vice President Dick Cheney has been on the front line. He's been on all these talk shows talking about, well, if we'd only done this, if Obama had left troops, which the Iraqis did not want U.S. troops.
Iraqis didn't
and
want.
the Iranians didn't want the troops there either.
Right.
So you've got all this misinformation still coming out again from the architects of a failed policy. Are we learning from this, or can we turn this around and actually get objective information to the American public and people worldwide so they know what's going on?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the media coverage of this has been somewhat skewed. The Bush people have done a good job of respinning the same spin in some ways. But what we forget is that the 2007 surge, the idea of putting more troops into Iraq that somehow saved Iraq, and it did. I mean, it helped the process stabilize. But what we forget is that that surge was accompanied with the Sunni awakening.
Exactly.
With Sunni moderates saying no to al-Qaeda in Iraq, to the brutality of al-Qaeda in Iraq. So it was Iraqis themselves coupled with American forces. And Nouri al-Maliki shares a lot of the blame here for the current situation. After December 2011 and our withdrawal, al-Maliki made it clear that this was going to be a patronage system in which the Shia would get patronage and the benefits of the system. In essence, it was a reversal of what Saddam Hussein had done with the Sunni vis-a-vis the Shia. That has left a lot of Sunni very angry. And that's not to say that the Sunni as a population support ISIL, but it is to say that they have been less reluctant not to support ISIL for the moment. But there are a lot of voices coming out of Iraq that are saying the sectarianism has to end, including the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, the Shia Grand Ayatollah, saying that sectarianism is bad and that you have to move beyond this in order to have a more unified state. And everyone needs to be battling ISIL.
Exactly. And you were talking about the Sunni awakening. Of course, part of that was we were paying the Sunnis to be involved.
Absolutely.
And then Nouri al-Maliki discontinued the payments to them, and all of a sudden their economic lifeline was cut off. So now, and he was not inclusive. The idea was if you have the Sunnis, you have the Shiites, you have the Kurds, you bring them into an inclusive government, and basically he marginalized the Kurds and the Sunnis and really co-opted the power for himself, and now he's paying the price.
Absolutely, because even most recently when the talk of a national salvation government from Ayad Alawi, who's another Shia, secular Shia, was raised, Nouri al-Maliki rejected it immediately. And even Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi army have declared that we need an emergency government that's going to prevent the spread of ISIL and the insurgents. So Nouri al-Maliki right now is in a very precarious position. On the other hand, who else is the big question right now? Because Nouri al-Maliki won a plurality of the seats in the most recent elections, and his closest opponent isn't very close. Nouri al-Maliki won about 132 seats, I believe it was, or 123 seats, and Ayad Alawi won 23 seats. So it becomes very difficult to determine if there would be someone else as a prime minister at this point when they meet.
Exactly. And as I mentioned, what we say today will be history tomorrow by the time the program airs.
Absolutely, because they're meeting July 1st tomorrow.
Exactly. So if you look at the situation, look over the horizon, is there any way to pull together, assuming al-Maliki stays or he goes, whichever, is there any way to pull these three groups together and to create this unity government to some degree, an inclusive government, or do you see Iraq breaking up into three separate countries?
That's the $5 trillion question,
Is it?
right?
Okay.
That's the question that is the most difficult to
No
answer.
low numbers.
Yeah,
high
no low
numbers.
numbers. It's a high number. The reality is that I think grassroots, there's a desire to have a unity among Iraqis. You see this in among more grassroots Shia politicians as well as Sunni politicians and Kurds. The Kurds have essentially set up their own semi-autonomous region, so they're okay with the way things are as long as the ISIL and other groups don't rock that certain autonomy that they have. Unity is possible, but I think more likely is greater autonomy for the various regions. So you might still have an Iraq, but it's almost a confederated Iraq where the provinces have greater power than the actual national government at the moment. I think there are too many states who have interests in Iraq not breaking up, including Iran. Iran doesn't want an ISIL Islamic State, a Sunni Islamic State on its border by any means. And Syria, of course, is not thrilled about this. And most notably, a country we haven't even talked about much, Israel, is not prepared for an Iraq to break up either. And so I think there is an interest in keeping them unified to some extent. And the best case scenario might be a confederation where the provinces have a great deal more power or autonomy than the national government.
Exactly. And if we think back to 2008, talking about Israel, think back to 2008, 2009, and the horrific conflict that took place between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, just immense suffering, strafing taking place. It really was a tragic situation. Of course, Gaza is one of the poorest places on the face of the earth. They have fewer services there than in most countries. You have a situation now where the peace process has broken down, and it looks very dubious that it's going to be reignited anytime soon. Seems like with all of these negative ingredients there, with the devastation of Gaza, with the collapse of the peace process, the building of settlements, which continues to go and go and go, that it seems to me that frustration is what really defines what's going on in that area. I think the Palestinians are frustrated, the Israelis are probably frustrated, the neighbors are frustrated.
Frustration and I think tension is another word, very heightened tension. Again, today the three female teenagers were found, all three dead, north of Hebron. The Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, is claiming that this is Hamas's doing. Hamas has not claimed that they are involved in any way whatsoever. This only serves to heighten the tensions, both between the settlers and Palestinians within the occupied territories, but also between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. And the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is trying a unity government between Fatah and Hamas has created obvious problems for Netanyahu's government, although I'm not convinced that Netanyahu was really interested in pursuing peace to begin with. In part, I think his rift with Obama goes deep enough that he's not prepared to deliver this American president any kind of peace deal that would be a success. Obama's been smart enough to get cover by only getting his Secretary of State's involved in the peace process and staying out until the deal would be made, so that it's not him to blame in a sense. But you've got Gaza. You had missiles flying in Israel this morning and yesterday from Gaza. You have the continued movement of the Israeli army in the West Bank, initially to find these three teenagers, but my guess is that it will increase as a result of what has happened. I think the peace process it has fallen apart. And that began, I would argue, under the George W. Bush administration. I think there were chances after the Clinton administration that the George W. Bush administration ignored, in part because they supported Ariel Sharon and deemed the Palestinians as terrorists.
Exactly. And as I recall, the last 6 months of the Bill Clinton administration, they came very close to cracking a peace deal, but it just didn't quite get over the finish line. But at least the movement was in a positive direction.
Yeah, I mean, the real issue, I think, in the peace process is not necessarily getting the comprehensive peace. You're not going to solve Jerusalem in a day. But getting movement and continuing that movement. And the peace process broke down from 2000 to 2007. And then we had Annapolis, which was kind of the afterthought almost to the peace process in some ways. And it didn't really produce much of anything. And Annapolis, in part, emerged out of the Bush administration's concerns that Hamas had won a democratic election in 2006. And they were surprised. How could a group like Hamas win an election? And so they felt necessary to insert themselves into the Middle East peace process
Exactly.
as a result.
And as you look at it right now, Abbas is getting up in years. He's looking towards retirement. He obviously is frustrated. I'm sure Benjamin Netanyahu is frustrated. A lot of people are frustrated.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a lot of tension. But he is calling for the possibility of things. He first off wants this unity government with Hamas and Gaza and to merge them, which is going to be an interesting merger if it happens. But he's also threatened to dissolve the Palestinian state.
Yes.
What would happen if that happened? What would the scenario be if they just dissolved it? Well, first off, with the unity government. Secondly, if they don't get the unity government, what happens if they just say, we quit, we are just going to be members of the state of Israel?
Now, technically, you could argue they had a semblance of a unity government after 2006 when Hamas won the parliamentary elections because Abbas was still president at the time. The real issue of unity is connecting these two disconnected areas, Gaza and the West Bank, because there is no connection between them. And if Israel would even allow such a connection, so that I could travel if I was in Gaza to the West Bank or vice versa. And in medical supplies and other things could travel back and forth, and there could be some semblance of trade between the two. In terms of dissolving the Palestinian state, the irony there is that it would probably end up hurting the Palestinians more than it would hurt anyone else, because most likely the Israelis would suggest, well, the Palestinians don't want to do it. We have a security problem, and Israeli occupation would increase rather than decrease in such a situation because of the threat of instability or uncertainty that the Israeli government might see.
Exactly. And this whole situation, and we've sort of moved away from Israel right now because the fact that the conflict has not been quite as rampant as has been in Syria and in Iraq, but it's still a major festering point. It's still a major problem, and it has to be dealt with. You were talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, and a lot of people share your opinion that he is not a proponent of peace, or as much as he could be. But of course, he, by the same token, has a very weak hand in that he has a coalition government, and part of his coalition are parties that really want to repress the Palestinians. They would like to oust them if they could and take over all of the area and not have anything to do with the Palestinians.
Yeah,
How does he deal with that?
Well, not easily.
Not easily.
is the answer.
Right.
He does have a government that could collapse. That he could have parties that leave, and he would have to either remake a coalition or there'd have to be new elections. So certainly that's a factor. But I also think that's a good excuse for him, too. On some of this. So I think it cuts both ways for Netanyahu in terms of a strategy on this, on the peace issue. The thing that is, I think, particularly concerning is that because our focus is on Iraq and Syria at the moment, it gives Netanyahu and the Israeli government a bit of a freer hand. The Israelis have been using bulldozers, and they've been using the army and tanks into the West Bank in the search for these three teenagers. That has gone virtually unnoticed by the American public and by American policymakers to a large extent, at least publicly unnoticed. And so the danger is that the situation gets beyond a point at which the United States can actually have any kind of persuasive influence. And that's not to say John Kerry has been working diligently on this, but it takes more than John Kerry alone for success to occur.
It certainly does. And this area of the world is so important, and it is so destabilized now, especially since the Iraqi invasion of 2003. A lot of people are arguing, they say we'd be better off. You can't go back in history or put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but they're saying we'd be better off with Saddam Hussein back.
The devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
And have that buffer zone. But we do need to learn much more about this. And there are some journalists in the United States who are doing an excellent job covering it. But a large part of the U.S. mainstream media are making the same errors that we made back in 2003. They're putting on people like Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and people like that who were the architects of a failed policy. And we really need to scratch the surface and look for some other sources of information so we don't make the same mistakes. But Dr. Michael Cairo, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Being here.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.